Cody Brown once stood as a symbol of unconventional family values, a man whose name became synonymous with polygamy through the reality TV series that showcased his life with multiple wives in a complex dynamic that captivated audiences for years. But behind the scenes and far from the cameras, a storm was brewing, one that would eventually explode into legal chaos, public fallout, and a media frenzy that neither he nor his wives could have predicted. What began as a lifestyle choice portrayed as harmonious and grounded in shared beliefs, slowly unraveled into a web of conflicting interests, emotional breakdowns, and now court battles that threaten to dismantle everything he built. The documents that have surfaced are nothing short of stunning. They expose years of tension, financial disputes, custody disagreements, and a mounting list of accusations that paint a very different picture than what viewers were led to believe. The first crack in the foundation came when one of the wives reportedly filed a motion challenging the legality of their financial arrangement, raising questions about who really held power and control within the household. According to leaked transcripts, she claims that Cody exerted disproportionate influence over shared assets, made major decisions without group consensus, and kept critical information from some of the wives. This triggered a wave of further disclosures from other parties who began to reveal long-buried frustrations, including alleged manipulation, emotional neglect, and uneven treatment among the wives'. Court filings describe an environment where autonomy was gradually stripped away and replaced with a centralized structure that favored Cody's preferences. The legal team representing one of the wives argued that this imbalance had created a toxic hierarchy where dissent was discouraged and loyalty was rewarded, often at the expense of fairness. The court is now being asked to determine whether some of the verbal agreements that defined their family for over a decade can be considered legally binding, or if they amount to coercion under the guise of spiritual leadership. The implications of this case stretch far beyond the Brown family it challenges. How society views plural relationships, especially when those involved begin to speak out about imbalance, harm, and lack of agency. Attorneys on both sides are preparing for what they describe as a potentially precedent-setting battle involving not just financial reparations, but custody and long-term living arrangements. Some of the children who are now of age have also submitted statements describing their own experience growing up in a household that often felt fractured despite the united front presented on television. These statements are raw and emotional, underscoring how the dynamics impacted them and how they now perceive their upbringing. The judge overseeing the case has expressed concern over the emotional toll this process may take and has requested psychological evaluations to assess the well-being of those involved. Cody Brown, meanwhile, has maintained that all decisions were made with the family's best interests in mind, and that any allegations of control or coercion are being taken out of context. His legal team argues that the wives were fully aware of the structure and voluntarily participated in the arrangement. But as more details come to light, including text messages, financial logs, and video evidence that was never aired on the show, the question is no longer whether this was a functioning plural family, but whether it functioned at the expense of individual freedom and informed consent. The public has been quick to react, with social media exploding in debate. Some defend Cody, saying he is being unfairly targeted for his lifestyle, while others say the case reveals long-standing issues that were masked by the glamour of reality TV. Some fans have even turned their backs, citing disappointment in how much was concealed from the audience and calling for accountability from the network that produced the show. Producers have remained silent thus far, but insiders hint that internal reviews are underway and future projects featuring the family may be put on hold until the legal process concludes. With each passing day, the stakes grow higher, and the lines between private life and public spectacle blur further for a family that once chose to live in the spotlight. Their truth is now being dissected in the harshest light imaginable, and there seems to be no turning back as the courtroom drama continues to unfold. More revelations are beginning to surface that further complicate the already tangled narrative surrounding Cody Brown and his plural marriage structure. Key testimony from one of the former wives detailed a pattern of emotional distancing that began years before the family appeared on television and allegedly worsened as the show gained popularity. She described how the fame altered Cody's behavior, claiming he became increasingly focused on public image, while the emotional needs of the family were quietly sidelined. According to her testimony, their spiritual bond turned into what she called a performance-based relationship, where love and support were conditional on compliance with unwritten rules. Those rules, she said, were never discussed openly, but were enforced through emotional withdrawal and selective attention. She painted a picture of a man who used silence and approval as tools of influence, creating an atmosphere where fear of exclusion kept many from speaking their minds. These claims were backed up by journal entries and emails that were admitted into evidence, which chronicled years of confusion, sadness, and self-doubt from multiple family members. One entry from a daughter read that she often felt like a guest in her own home, unsure of where she stood or whether she was truly loved. The emotional cost of living under constant surveillance, both by cameras and within the family dynamic, is now a central theme in the case. The defense, however, maintains that the wives had agency and choice at every step. They argue that the challenges the family now faces are the result of individual grievances magnified by media attention, not systemic control or abuse to support their case. They presented signed statements and video clips that appear to show consensus on major family decisions, including housing, education, and income-sharing arrangements. Their position is that the plaintiffs are now rewriting history to align with changing social attitudes and personal dissatisfaction rather than objective facts. But the court seems to be weighing both sides carefully, especially in light of the psychological evaluations that are reportedly revealing signs of trauma, anxiety, and identity confusion among several of the adult children, while those reports have been sealed. Sources close to the case suggest they are playing a significant role in shaping the judge's approach to custody recommendations and long-term support needs. Experts in family law have also weighed in, noting that the lack of legal recognition for plural marriages complicates matters significantly in traditional divorce proceedings. There are legal frameworks that guide asset division, spousal support, and custody. But in this case, the court must interpret informal spiritual commitments and verbal understandings that span over a decade and multiple households. This gray area creates room for both misinterpretation and manipulation, making the task of assigning responsibility even more difficult. In a surprising twist, one of the younger sons reportedly submitted a private video diary to the court in which he reflected on growing up with shifting alliances and unclear authority. He spoke of being confused about who to turn to for guidance and feeling pressure to pick sides when conflict arose between the wives or between them and Cody. His account added a deeply personal layer to the legal discourse, emphasizing the impact of the family structure on emotional development and personal stability. According to court insiders, this video was played in a closed session and moved several attendees to tears, prompting renewed calls for a child-centered resolution strategy. As the trial moves forward, the public continues to follow every detail with intensity. News outlets, legal analysts, and social commentators are dissecting the arguments and evidence, trying to predict the outcome and what it could mean for families living under similar arrangements. There is now talk of potential legislative proposals that could emerge from this high-profile case, including protections for individuals in spiritual unions and clearer definitions of consent and autonomy within unconventional family structures. Such reforms would be groundbreaking, but they also raise questions about how much the state should intervene in matters of faith and voluntary association. Cody Brown, for his part, has remained mostly silent in public appearances, letting his legal team do the talking. But he was recently spotted entering the courthouse with a visibly tense demeanor, and accompanied by two of the adult children whose loyalties appear to remain with him. Their presence was seen by some as a strategic show of unity, while others viewed it as an attempt to influence the optics of the case. Behind-the-scenes sources claim there are growing divisions even among the children, with some supporting the legal action against Cody and others urging for reconciliation and healing instead of prolonged litigation. This internal split mirrors the broader debate unfolding across social media, where fans and critics continue to clash over accountability, privacy, and the blurred lines between personal faith and public responsibility. As the proceedings entered their next phase, the focus shifted toward the financial structure that supported the Brown family. For over a decade, court documents and expert testimony began to outline how the shared income from their reality show book deals, public appearances, and merchandise was divided among the wives' children and Cody himself. According to forensic accountants called by the plaintiffs, the system was anything but equal, with Cody allegedly controlling the main bank accounts and making final decisions on large purchases, travel budgets, and business investments. This revelation sparked concern among legal analysts, who pointed out that in a family structure where each adult is considered spiritually married yet legally independent, Such financial control could blur the line between cooperation and coercion. One former wife testified that she was often required to present written justifications for any expenses over a few $100s, while Cody had unrestricted access to the family funds. Her emotional account of having to plead for money to cover her own dental surgery left the courtroom visibly moved. She said, "The financial gatekeeping reinforced a power imbalance that made her feel less like a partner and more like a dependent." She recalled multiple instances where questioning the system led to emotional shutdowns and silent treatments from Cody, reinforcing the idea that financial obedience was equated with familial harmony. The defense, however, countered these claims by presenting detailed spreadsheets and signed statements which they argued showed mutual agreement on financial decisions. They maintained that any differences in access were based on logistical convenience, not manipulation or control, and they emphasized that the wives were not legally bound to Cody and were free to make independent financial choices if they wished. Legal experts say this argument may not hold under psychological scrutiny, especially if the environment created an unspoken rule that dissent was punished even if not formally outlawed. Further complicating matters was the issue of property ownership. Several homes were purchased under Cody's name or jointly with specific wives, which the court must now untangle without the benefit of standard marital contracts. Each home has different histories and occupants, and deciding who gets what will require more than just a financial audit. The emotional weight of what those homes represent is also a factor, with one former wife describing her house as both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she raised her children and watched her own sense of worth quietly erode through years of feeling unseen and unheard. Psychological professionals brought in as independent consultants testified that financial dependency often correlates with emotional suppression, particularly in plural marriage structures where hierarchy can be enforced through soft power rather than explicit rules. This soft power, according to them, can be harder to prove but is no less impactful, especially when it affects decisions around health, education, and personal development. One particularly powerful moment came when a teenage daughter submitted a letter to the judge describing how the uneven flow of money made her feel less valuable than her siblings. She detailed instances where her requests for school supplies or extracurricular activities were delayed or denied, while other siblings seemed to receive quicker and more generous responses. Her words painted a picture of silent competition, where children were unintentionally caught in a system that rewarded alignment with Cody's preferences over independent thinking. The letter was read aloud in court, prompting a long pause before proceedings resumed. This moment became a turning point in public perception, with media outlets picking up the story and sparking national conversations about emotional economics in unconventional families. As the court continues to deliberate these complex issues, more witnesses are expected to testify, including financial advisors, tax preparers, and production staff. From the reality show, their testimonies could provide critical insight into how much of the family's financial narrative was crafted for television and how much reflected their actual lived experience. The line between reality and performance remains one of the most contested aspects of the case, especially as it relates to accountability. The outcome of this case is now being closely watched, not just for its legal implications, but for its cultural resonance. It raises difficult questions about what constitutes consent in family arrangements that rely heavily on spiritual doctrine and social expectation, rather than legal contract, and it underscores the need for nuanced legal frameworks that can address emotional harm, even in the absence of physical abuse or overt coercion. For now, all eyes remain on the courtroom as Cody Brown's past financial decisions continue to be scrutinized in ways that could alter the very foundation of how spiritual unions are understood in American family law. As the courtroom transitioned into the fourth day of testimony, the emotional intensity grew more palpable. With each witness that took the stand, this part of the case turned its attention toward the psychological dynamics within the Brown household, especially during the final years when the family began unraveling under the weight of public scrutiny and internal strain. Several former family therapists who had been consulted by the Browns during their television run were now providing sworn statements to clarify the emotional atmosphere they had observed behind closed doors. One therapist described what she called a cycle of emotional suppression masked by religious devotion, stating that many of the family members, particularly the wives, had been conditioned to prioritize group harmony over individual truth. This dynamic, she explained, often silenced dissent and created a culture where discomfort or disagreement was seen as selfish or disloyal to the family mission. She added that while Cody Brown rarely issued direct commands, his preferences were felt as mandates by those closest. To him, former wives echoed this sentiment, describing moments when decisions about parenting, relocation, or even medical treatments were made based on what they called the ripple effect of Cody's mood, rather than a shared dialogue they described. A climate in which raising a concern often led to emotional distancing or public shaming within the family structure, which was then edited out of the show to preserve the image of cohesion. One particularly striking testimony came from a former production assistant on the reality show who claimed that certain moments of tension were intentionally edited or reshot to present a more unified image of the family. She described scenes where family members were encouraged to repeat statements, with more positive framing, and where Cody was often allowed to veto any content that made him appear unsympathetic. This revelation sparked a flurry of reactions, both in the courtroom and across social media, with critics arguing that such selective editing may have contributed to a distorted public perception of plural marriage and the emotional toll it can carry. Legal analysts pointed out that this form of narrative control could become relevant if it's proven that the show's portrayal influenced legal or financial decisions made by the family in real life, such as custody arrangements, asset distribution, or tax filings. Another former wife testified about what she described as the invisible scoring system within the family, where favor with Cody translated into access to better resources, more screen time, and emotional validation. She explained that this favoritism affected not only the adults, but also the children, many of whom became acutely aware of who was in good standing and who was not. She spoke about the exhaustion of trying to maintain that favor and how it led her to compromise on personal boundaries just to preserve peace in the home. Her account was supported by excerpts from personal journals and emails, submitted as evidence, all painting a portrait of quiet, emotional erosion, masked by smiles and rehearsed sound bites. The defense attempted to counter these narratives by emphasizing the voluntary nature of the family structure, arguing that each adult entered and exited the relationship on their own terms. They also noted that the reality show was a commercial enterprise, and like any televised production, required editing for time, clarity, and tone. However, the prosecution pushed back, highlighting that viewers and even legal authorities may have made real-life decisions based on the polished version of the family story, which lacked context or full consent from all participants. The court also heard from child development experts who discussed the long-term effects of growing up in emotionally inconsistent environments, particularly when those environments are televised and commodified. They explained how children in such families often struggle with identity formation, emotional regulation, and trust due to the mixed signals they receive between public praise and private tension. One expert warned that unless proper support systems are implemented, some of the children may carry psychological scars well into adulthood. As Day 4 concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom was one of sobering reflection, with even the judge remarking on the unprecedented nature of the case. Combining elements of family law, media ethics, religious freedom, and emotional well-being into a single legal narrative, it was clear that this was not just a case about one man or one family, but a broader conversation about how society defines family leadership and the cost of performing happiness for public consumption with more witnesses expected to appear in the coming sessions. The question remains how much of the truth was edited out, and whether those omissions now carry legal weight in a courtroom, determined to uncover the reality behind the reality show as the courtroom proceedings draw to a close. The Cody Brown case leaves behind a trail of revelations that go far beyond the surface of family drama. What began as a legal examination of custody and assets has now evolved into a deep reckoning with the emotional, spiritual, and psychological structures that held the Brown family together and ultimately tore them apart. The testimony of former wives, children, therapists, and media insiders has painted a picture of a carefully curated reality built for cameras and viewers, but often at the expense of genuine human experience. It has become clear that beneath the smiling family photos and scripted moments lay a complex web of power dynamics, silent suffering, and a relentless effort to maintain an image that was no longer real. The courtroom became a space where voices long silenced were finally heard, where journal entries replaced edited episodes, and where emotional truth stood face to face with media illusion. What is perhaps most striking is how this case is forcing a broader cultural reflection on the nature of televised families and the unseen cost of turning private lives into public entertainment. It raises urgent questions about consent, narrative manipulation, and the emotional toll of performing stability for an audience. This conclusion is not just about who wins or loses legally. It is about what society learns from a family that once invited the world into their home and now must confront the consequences of that exposure, as the final arguments are made and the judge prepares a ruling. The world watches not just for a verdict, but for meaning, for a reckoning with what it means to lead a family, love in public, and live with the truth when the cameras finally stop rolling. This is not just the end of a case. It is the beginning of a much larger conversation.